to folks in the room and to folks on the webcast. We will be starting shortly. We're just waiting for people to filter in. Viewers of the webcast, thank you for your patience. We will be starting in about 1 minute. Okay, welcome everyone here in the room and on the webcast. My name is Chris Calfee. I'm Senior Counsel at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and you have found yourself at our public meeting on a CEQA guidelines update regarding evaluation of hazards. If you are not interested in that topic, you may be in the wrong room or in the wrong webcast. Just to go over briefly what we intend to talk about today, I introduced myself. I'm, again, Chris Calfee, Senior Counsel. With me today, I have two colleagues from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. We have Sam Diaz, if you want to wave your hand, and Michael McCormick, also participating today. We will cover in the formal presentation portion a little bit of background on what this particular set of proposed guidelines updates are. We'll walk through an explanation of OPR's proposal, and then we'll open up the floor to public comment. For those of you participating via webcast, you can submit questions or comments via the CEQA guidelines email address. That's ceqa.guidelines@resources.ca.gov. And then finally, we'll wrap up with next steps. So just a little bit of background. The CEQA guidelines are administrative regulations that implement the California Environmental Quality Act. The regulations are intended to provide guidance to public agencies on how to implement CEQA and follow its procedures. They also form the base. They also inform public participation in the CEQA process. The guidelines are developed first at the Office of Planning and Research, and then they go through a formal administrative rulemaking process that's conducted by the Natural Resources Agency. A key note is that the CEQA guidelines, since they are administrative regulations, they must fall within the four corners of the CEQA statute. So they can't add new requirements that aren't already provided in statute, and they can't remove any requirements that are there in statute. The CEQA guidelines also need to be consistent with case law, which will be particularly significant for this particular update. So among the CEQA guidelines is a provision in section 15126.2 subdivision A of the CEQA guidelines. And that provision it sets forth the requirements for an environmental impact report on the evaluation of potentially significant environmental effects. It says that EIRs are to identify and focus on significant effects of a proposed project. It goes in depth, however, to say that EIRs also need to address the significant effects of drawing new project occupants to a particular location. The existing guideline uses an example of seismic hazards and says that if a project may bring people to an area with an active fault, an EIR should analyze the potential impacts of seismic hazards to project occupants. The existing guideline also gives examples of other potentially hazardous locations that should be evaluated, and it gives examples of floodplains, coastlines, and wildfire risk areas that should be analyzed as part of an environmental analysis. Just last year, the Supreme Court had the occasion to look at that particular guideline section in a case involving a challenge brought by an industry association to an air district's own CEQA guidelines. That particular guideline developed by the air district would require the analysis of potential hazards to project occupants that locate near sources of toxic air contaminants, particularly freeways and other stationary sources. The Building Industry Association argued that the phrase in the CEQA statute, environmental effects of a project, should not be understood to apply to the effects of the environment on a project, rather only to a project's impacts to its surrounding environment. The court held in that case that generally agencies are not required to analyze the impact of existing environmental conditions on a project's future users or residents. That's the general rule. They also stated, however, that when a proposed project may exacerbate existing risks, then an agency must analyze those potential exacerbating effects of such hazards on future residents and users. In reaching that conclusion, the Supreme Court held that the two sentences involving seismic hazards in the existing CEQA guidelines section were invalid because in its view, those sentences would not involve exacerbating risks. However, the remainder of the section, including the references to coastlines, flooding hazards, and wildfire risk hazards, it found those to be valid expressions of the statute because they did refer to potentially exacerbating effects of a project. So in light of that holding, OPR does propose to amend section 15126.2 to be consistent with the court's holding in that case. So I'll walk through briefly the changes that OPR proposes. The first change that OPR would make is to add in the phrase "or risk exacerbating" to the sentence saying that an EIR should evaluate the potential impacts of bringing development to hazardous locations. Second, OPR would strike the sentences related to seismic hazards that the court found to be invalid. Third, the OPR would add language specifying that the exacerbating risks and the potential impacts that should be part of an analysis include direct, indirect, and cumulative effects of a project. We do propose to strike the word "other" because now we're only having one sentence with an illustration of potential hazards. And finally, OPR proposes to add language stating that the analysis should include both short-term risks and long-term conditions. The last portion is important because, in particular, the effects of climate change that projects may exacerbate may not be currently a hazardous condition, but may in the future become a hazardous condition. So that's a real brief overview of the changes that OPR proposes to make. More explanation is provided in the documents that are on OPR's website. So next steps, the comment period on this proposal closes today. So we do ask that if you're watching them on the website, or if you're taking notes here in the room, that you do provide any comments by 5 o'clock today. Once we have a chance to review all of the comments, we'll make any adjustments that may be necessary in light of those comments, and eventually wrap this set of proposed changes into a larger set of updates that we will send to the Natural Resources Agency to undertake the formal administrative rulemaking process. I'll note that formal rulemaking process does include additional opportunities for public review and input, and also likely public hearings. Again, all of the update materials are available on OPR's website at www.opr.ca.gov. In terms of providing input on this draft, should you so choose, we always ask people to consider limits on time and resources, so if you could focus your comments on the pieces that are most important to you, that would be appreciated. Also, very much appreciated are any factual and legal support for any suggestions that you might provide. Again, here's the email address that we ask people to send their comments to. That's CEQA.guidelines@resources.ca.gov. And again, before 5 o'clock today would be appreciated. So at this point in the hearing, we do want to open it up to any public comment. Any folks in the room, do you intend to submit any comments? I'm getting head shaking no here in the room. Sam, has anyone submitted any comments on the email? Okay. So far we have heard none yet. I will hang out for the next 15 minutes or so, just in case anyone does show up and would like to speak. We'll also be monitoring the email address during the next 15 minutes or so. So I'll just briefly pause and allow people to exit if they so desire. And again, we'll be waiting here to monitor the email over the web. So thanks to those who did come in person.